This
Catherine.
conference will now be recorded.
All right. Oh well. Thank you everybody for tuning in and letting me, I suppose, share some of my thoughts on Genesis 49. This is a subject that I've actually really enjoyed studying over the years. I've looked at it a number of different ways. So what we did last week, just as a recap, and for those who might not have been here, we looked at the symbols of the 12 different sons that are the predominant symbols. Reuben, we saw the symbol of power and of water, being unstable as water. We saw Simeon and Levi, instruments of cruelty. Judah was the symbol of the lion. Zebulun, like a ship, a haven for ships. Issachar was a strong bone donkey, and so on. And what we did was we looked at how these symbols are actually very appropriate to the 12 different tribes, and those symbols come out in the history of the nation time and time again, relating to those 12 sons. We didn't look at the tribe of Joseph. We deliberately kind of left that because we knew we were running out of time. So I'm going to start quickly with the tribe of Joseph in terms of the symbols that are used for Joseph. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look, I suppose, at the point that we looked at last week in when we got everybody to look at the order of the sons and to why Jacob deliberately changes the order of the sons into the order they are given, and how this was actually prophetic, because he explains to them, let me tell you what's going to befall you in the latter days, or in the last days. So this whole blessing, although it was on individual sons, it also has a greater prophetic nature about it, and we'll look at that, hopefully, if we don't run out of time. So just in terms of Joseph, the key symbol of the tribe of Joseph is that of the vine. A fruitful vine is the main symbol. So it starts off straight away that Joseph is a fruitful bough, a fruitful branch of a vine by a spring, or a well, or a fountain, and its branches of the vine, it says, go over the wall. And this is a picture of a vine that's so fruitful, it's breaching the boundary of a wall. Now, whether the wall is a spring or whether the wall is like a city wall, but the picture is of a vine that is so fruitful, it is extending where it's growing. Most vineyards, of course, in the story of Jesus in the parable of the vineyard or the vine dressers, and in Isaiah chapter 5, the vine dressers would enclose the vineyard in a wall. Well, this was a picture of a vineyard which is running over the wall. It's just virulent in terms of its fruitfulness. Something really interesting in the Hebrew here. The word for branches is actually the word used most commonly for daughters. It's the feminine offspring, and it's used often also of a village, which is like the daughter of a city. So like a village that resides outside a city. So for instance, you know, in Revelation, it talks about Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and it talks about her daughters, who the daughters of the city. This is the same idea. The daughter of the city is like an extended village. So you get that idea again of prosperity, of growth, but really interesting that the actual Hebrew has this connection of a female connection within this word, who's, in fact, I think some translations actually say, whose daughters go over the wall. Now, here's where it gets really interesting for the story of Joseph, because in history, this, of course, really did happen. There's the story of the daughters of Zelophehad, and you might know this story. I think it's Numbers 36 is probably the main story of the daughters of Zelophehad. They twice come to Moses, but these are 5 daughters that are 5 wise virgins. These are 5 daughters who are about to lose their inheritance. They come from the tribe of Manasseh, which was, of course, one of the sons of Joseph. And they are daughters of the children of Manasseh, but because their father has died and has no male offspring, the inheritance was in jeopardy to be lost. And so a special law was provided for them by Moses that providing they marry within their own tribe, they could maintain their inheritance. So it didn't get lost. But what was interesting with that is they ended up with 2 inheritances, because if they married someone of Manasseh, they also had an inheritance within Manasseh, their husband, but they carried with them their father's inheritance. So they actually married and ended up with a double portion, which becomes an interesting story in this blessing of Joseph, whose daughters flow over the wall. And here's this picture of the extended border of Manasseh, and particularly with these 5 wise virgins who are commanded only to marry in the Lord. Beautiful picture where Jesus picks up something similar, I think, in the parable with the 10 virgins. Not the only case where this theme comes in. In John chapter 4, Jesus comes to the very area of Shechem, and he goes outside the city. Specifically says he goes outside the city to a place outside the city wherein there was a well there where Jacob had given this to Joseph. And of course, who does he meet there? He meets there the woman of Samaria, and he preaches to her and offers her this incredible gift. She runs back into the city. She explains with joy to all the men of the city, and they come out to meet Jesus. So there's a little quote in Isaiah chapter 12, verse 5 there, which says, "With joy you will draw out the water of the wells of salvation." So I just wanted to highlight those 2 specific things in relation to the blessing of Joseph in terms of the symbol of the vine. And of course, we will come back to that again in the next part when we look at the prophetic side of this, pointing forward to the time of Jesus. So that was our quick little background on Joseph. I'm doing this reasonably fast. There's a lot more we could say on this, but those 2 pictures of the daughters of Zelophehad and the woman of Samaria and the daughters going over the well, isn't that an awesome picture of the woman of Samaria and of the daughters of Zelophehad? It's a cool application to the blessing of Jacob upon Joseph. So just before we move on to looking at the prophetic side of this prophecy or this blessing, I just wanted you to note that in Judges, there's this cool picture of where all the judges came from. And even though not all the 12 tribes are mentioned there with the 12 judges that are mentioned in the story of the Judges, you'll see that they represent geographically pretty much covering a fantastic spread of the tribes and their geographical portions in the land. So that's kind of a cool picture. Right, let's get on to something which is quite fascinating. So we looked at this slide before, and we saw that in the natural order of birth, when Jacob comes to do the blessings, there's a bit of changing going around, particularly after the first 4 sons and the last 2 sons appear to be in order. So 6 of them appear to be in order, but then 6 of them appear to be quite jumbled in terms of their order. And the question is why does Jacob do this? Is this just random? Is this just accidental? Did he forget the ages of the sons? And the point we made last week is Jacob very much, even though he was an incredibly old man, had his wits about him when it came to these children. He, in the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh, he knew exactly who was the elder and the younger, and he deliberately blessed Ephraim above Manasseh, the younger being blessed above the elder. So he knew what he was doing. So here's a suggestion in terms of the reason of this order. And I'm going to suggest to you that Genesis 49 is a snapshot of Israel's history from the time they come into the land of Israel until AD 70, until the end of the Jewish age in AD 70. And that these sons represent every different epoch, every different stage in Israel's history. So we're going to go through that and talk about it. I think there's something really fascinating with the other blessing in Deuteronomy 33, which we might look at in another Bible class series, but I think Deuteronomy chapter 33 picks up the story of the future of Israel after they return back into their land starting from 1948. But anyway, going by this snapshot, let's see if this works. So the first one, of course, is Reuben. And the point it says of Reuben, it says, you shall not excel. Now, under Reuben, of course, who was ambitious, who went up into his father's bed, disgraced his father, because he was unstable as water, he wasn't focused and single-minded, the record says he would not excel. The history and the story of the judges, for instance, in Joshua, when Israel first came into the land under Joshua, in Judges 15, 16, 17, at the end of the story of Joshua, over and again, it says they failed to drive out the Canaanite. They failed to drive out the Jebusites, so they lived amongst them. So you can look at those. Perhaps we could look at a couple. Joshua chapter 15, verse 63. That's pretty hard because there's no Joshua 16, verse 53. Joshua 16, verse 10. However, they did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites have lived in the midst of Ephraim unto this day, but have been made to do forced labor. So this theme comes through quite a lot. Joshua 17, verses 12 and 13. Yet the people of Manasseh could not take the possession of the cities of the Canaanites, but the Canaanites persisted, dwelling in the land, and now the people of Israel grew strong. They put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they didn't utterly drive them out. So Reuben represents this time of Israel when they first came into the land, to the point where they were given this opportunity, but they didn't excel. They didn't meet their expectations, and they didn't take the inheritance fully as they ought to have. So following on from Joshua, okay, is the story of Simeon and Levi. And these two brothers are just typical of the story of Israel under the judges. You could pretty much describe Simeon and Levi as weapons of violence. the story of the Judges is just a story which is just filled with violence. In fact, the end of Judges summarizes these words with, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did that which was right in his own eyes. In fact, the bookends of the story of Judges are interesting because it starts with Simeon joining forces with Reuben to take a portion of land, and Reuben joining forces with Simeon to take their land. So you're introduced in the book of Judges to Simeon with Reuben taking their inheritance. The story at the end of Judges finishes with this horrific story of a Levite, and the story of Micah and a Levite, and this priest of Micah of the house of Levi that sets up false worship. So it's interesting that the bookends of Judges are the story of Simeon and Levi are found there. But if ever there was a description of the story, let me have a look. Hang on, I'm just going to do Judges chapter 17. There in Judges chapter 17. Might as well look at that end of the story of the book of Judges. So Judges chapter 17 from verse 5. That's the one with the story of the Levite. Verse 5, and it says, and the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod, household gods, ordained one of his sons to become a priest. In those days there was no king in the land of Israel. Everyone did that which is right in his own eyes. And there was a young man of Bethlehem, Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he sojourned there. And so what it does in verse 7, it gives you an example of what every man did that which is right in his own eyes in verse 6, and then in verse 7 it starts talking about this story of a Levite. So just interesting that Levi is connected with the whole story of the Judges. Well, after the story of Levi in the order comes, of course, the blessing of Judah, and this is the period of Israel of the king. So it's the beginning of the kingdom which started, of course, with the kingdom of Saul, but then became David's kingdom. And the third blessing upon Judah is all about the scepter shall not depart from Judah, that Judah is like a lion, the royalty of the royal line, but also it's couched in that phrase, Genesis 49 verse 8, of Judah, it says, your brothers will praise you. And like it's got this picture of praise and worship with Judah. And of course, David was taken from the tribe of Judah, and David became known as the king that worshiped, the king that played the harp, the king that sang. So this story of praise and worship under the kingly line was typical of the time period under David. The next stage, or the next son, was Zebulun. And the point with Zebulun is it says his tribe would extend right to Sidon, and he would become a haven for ships. This really was a perfect picture of the story of Zebulun, whose coastal border reached as far as Sidon, or Tyre and Sidon. Sidon was further north, where, of course, Solomon made a lot of business relationships with Hiram, the king of Tyre, and of course brought lots and lots of goods down from that area in ships, and that's a pretty cool sort of imagery of all the ports that Solomon made in his relationship with Tyre and Sidon. So Zebulun fits that reign very appropriately. The next son in the list, it says, is Issachar. And in the Hebrew, it says Issachar is a strong-boned donkey lying between two saddlebags. And the idea behind this is that, or some translations say, the donkey has laid down under the burden of two saddlebags. So the weight of the saddlebags is such that he becomes a slave laborer. And here's the picture of these two burdens all of a sudden of a divided kingdom. A kingdom which, because of the fact that they divided in their loyalties, they ended up becoming tributaries to many other nations after this time. So after Issachar, because of this, it says is the tribe of Dan. And this is a really apt picture of the story of after the divided kingdom, the establishment of the kingdom in the north under Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Jeroboam, of course, he made golden calves, and he set one in Dan and one in Bethel, and he caused all the people to worship there. And because of this, Dan became this place in the north of apostasy. And it was always, the serpent, of course, was a symbol of sin. And there you've got Dan as a serpent by the way that strikes. Of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, it constantly says Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. And every king after Israel that transgressed was measured against Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He was the source of transgression. And it says he was, or this king or that king was like Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. So again, this is a picture of Israel and Judah's successive sins and God's successive judgments upon them because of their transgressions. The next tribe that is mentioned in this is the tribe of Gad. And this is really a picture of God's final overthrow of the kingdom. Because of Gad, it says, a troop shall overcome, but he shall overcome at last. So Gad's idea of this troop shall overcome is an army shall overcome. And it's interesting that the first invaders that first started to come into the land under Tiglath-Pileser came in and they actually invaded the areas of Gad. In fact, it was a little bit earlier than that. What's his name? Ben-Hadad. Let's have a look rather than me doing this off memory. 2 Kings chapter 10. 2 Kings chapter 10. Verse 32, in those days the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. So this is the idea. It happened when Hazael defeated throughout the territory of Israel from Jordan eastward all the land of Gilead and the Gadites. So first on the list, when God begins to cut off the tribes of Israel, is Gad. So Gad is listed there, the land of Gilead, because under Ben-Hadad they came back and overthrew those areas. Later, incidentally, they took the areas back again, but finally, if you go to 2 Kings chapter 15, in verse 29, in the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came, captured Ijon, Abel, Beth-Maachah, Janoah, Kadesh, Hazor, Gilead, and Galilee, and all the land of Naphtali, and he carried the people away into captivity. So the invading Assyrian, when the northern kingdom was taken away, the land of Gilead, or Gad's area, was chief amongst those that were taken into captivity. So here's a picture of the captivity seen in the symbol of the story of Gad. The next son mentioned is Asher. And of Asher, it's really interesting. It says, Asher's shall be fed with royal delicacies, or his bread shall be the bread of kings. And it's fascinating that when God sent them into captivity, he told them to trust him there, and if they trusted him there, he would look after them. So if you look at Jeremiah chapter 4, for instance, Jeremiah chapter 4, verses 'That's not the one I was looking for. The wrong chapter down there. Anyway, God says to them in Jeremiah that he tells them to go, when they go into captivity, to build houses, to plant vineyards, to take wives, and to seek the peace of the people that were there, and to pray for them, and the peace would be upon them in captivity. And when you think about God's prosperity, Jeremiah 29, is it? Verse 5 and, yeah, sorry, Jeremiah 29, verses 4 to 7. But then when you look at the likes of Daniel, Mordecai, Esther, Nehemiah before the return, that they were all really well looked after. In fact, in Daniel chapter 2 of verse 5, of course, it says that Nebuchadnezzar gave to the Jewish captivity the king's portion. And remember the story of what, happened with Daniel not wanting to take of the king's meat. But Daniel chapter 2 in verse Daniel chapter 1 in verse 5. Daniel chapter 1 verse 5, the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and the wine that the king drank. So how does that sort of fit with the story of Asher? Is he shall feed on royal delicacies. So Asher is a typical of the nation in terms of the time period of when they went into captivity. The next son in the list is Naphtali. And Naphtali is like a hind or a deer set loose, set free, unbounding in freedom. And here's an incredible picture, really, of the story of the return from captivity after the decree of Cyrus. Ezra chapter 2, the king Cyrus of Persia says, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth unto me, and he chose me to build a temple for him in Jerusalem, in the country of Judah. And so this is the return of the Jews after 70 years into captivity. And the picture, of course, of the hind being set free and bounding across the hills back into the land, and the excitement they had of coming back. Pretty cool sort of picture in terms of Israel's history under the return from the decree of Cyrus. And then, of course, is the tribe of Joseph. And this is the story of Israel in the time of Jesus, the next epoch. And every symbol in there, of course, is a promise of the Messianic age. He's the fruitful bough, he's the shepherd, he's the rock. So every symbol of Joseph is pointing forward to Jesus as the good shepherd, the chief cornerstone, and he's also going to be the ones to gather the outcasts of Israel.
Big blessing.
Yeah, huge blessing. But aptly, the story of the Messianic age when God sent his son in his first appearing. And then the final one is Benjamin. And of Benjamin, it's really interesting because Benjamin, it talks about being a ravening wolf, tearing and devouring the flesh. He eats the prey in the morning, he divides the spoil at night. Benjamin, of course, means the son of my right hand. Jacob called him the son of my power. But this quote in Zechariah I find fascinating to the story of why Benjamin fits into this history of Israel so perfectly. So Zechariah 11 verse 13 says, and I took the 30 pieces of silver, and instantly your mind goes, of course, to the betrayal of Jesus. This is the story of the national rejection of the Messiah. I took the 30 pieces of silver and I cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord, and then I cut asunder my other staff, even bands, that I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. So this is the ending, a breaking of a covenant and an agreement. And then it says, verse 15, the Lord said to me, take unto thee the instruments of the foolish shepherd, for lo, I will raise a shepherd in the land who will eat the flesh of fat and tear their claws into pieces. Woe to the idle shepherd that leaves the flock. The sword will be upon his arm and upon his right eye. His arm shall be clean dried up, and his right eye shall be utterly broken. And it's a graphic picture of what was actually going to happen in terms of God's judgment in AD 70. So that's most of my Bible class in terms of the connection of the story of Israel's history. So you can see it wasn't random, and you can see how well they fit. If you really look at the 12 sons, they fit remarkably well, incredibly well, into the different periods of Israel's history, from the time they came into the land until the time of AD 70, when God's judgment came upon them. So I do have another little section, seeing as we've got time, which relates to the blessings of the 12 sons, and it comes in terms of looking at the story in Revelation chapter 7. Revelation chapter 7, of course, lists again the sons, and the sons are there listed, but not quite the same as Genesis chapter 49. But out of each nation has taken 12,000, and these are those, it says, who are sealed. They have the seal of God on them and protected, because it says they're going to be protected from God's judgment. So what's interesting is who's not there. So when you look at the list of the sealed tribes of Israel, the two tribes that are excluded is Dan and Ephraim. Remember, of course, on Jacob's blessing, Ephraim and Manasseh come under the one umbrella of Joseph. But when the land divided up, because the Levites didn't have an inheritance, Ephraim and Manasseh each carried an inheritance on their own. So Joseph became Ephraim and Manasseh when the tribes were divided. But here in Revelation, Joseph's back. Joseph's now included in this list, along with Manasseh, the eldest son, but Ephraim, the youngest son, is now not in the list, and neither is Dan. So, a couple of interesting things to question. Why are Dan and Ephraim excluded? and why are Levi and Joseph included? We haven't got time to do this fully. There's a lot in this, but I'm going to make a suggestion for Dan and Ephraim. So I'm going to do the first part. So what's really fascinating, first of all, about Dan, because we already looked at this, is Dan in the story of Judges becomes, it's the beginning of the story of apostasy. It's the setting up of an altar in Dan by Jonathan, who was the grandson of Moses, Judges chapter 18, verse 13. Later, Jeroboam sets up a golden calf, believed to be in exactly the same spot. So there's my lovely picture of a golden calf there. He's pretty awesome picture, but that's actually a picture of what they believe is the altar in Tel Dan, the mountain of Dan. So it became a center of apostasy. So that's a good reason for it to be excluded in Revelation. But wait, there's more. So one of the other things with Dan is it in fact was the heart or the source of the Jordan River. In fact, the Jordan didn't become named till after the settlement of the land in Joshua's day, and it's believed that Jordan is made up of Jor plus Dan, which means coming down from Dan, because the headwater of the Jordan was way up in the northern area at the base of Mount Hermon. And on this other slide you can see on the left, you'll see what they believe to be Jeroboam's golden calf that he set up. And then you can see the headwaters of the Jordan River coming right from that area, which flowed down and supplied life for the Jordan River. So it was a very popular spot. It's the source of the largest, what they say, karst spring in the Middle East. And there's a note there that it flows at 240 million cubic meters per year. They say it's so cold that it makes your teeth rattle because it's fresh snow ball springs that come down from Hermon. I'll just go back before I do that. It also became an interesting place in terms of God's judgment in AD 70. So this area in particular suffered enormous judgment under Titus. After AD 70, in fact, it became the scene of the slaughter of thousands of Jews who were taken from Jerusalem, and they were taken all the way up to this area, and they were made public sporting spectacles, and they were given to wild beasts and slaughtered, some 2,500 of them. So it was a place which became severely judged in AD 70. A little other interesting thing is Jesus took the disciples to this place. This is Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus takes them to this area, which was actually a pagan place of worship, worshipping the god Pan. And you'll see there the Pan there was a naughty little god. He was half man, half goat, and apparently he would go run into the cities at night, and he would terrify people to death, scaring them. And that's where your word panic comes from. It's also where the word pandemic comes from. It's where the pan flute comes from. It's where Peter Pan comes from. So this place was actually known as the gates of hell. And if you remember, when Jesus takes the disciples up there, he goes to Peter and he says, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said to him, flesh and blood has not revealed this unto you, but my Father in heaven. Interesting fact, Pan was the god of revelations. So he was the God who had all the revealing of future things to him. So Jesus says, my Father has revealed this unto you, and you are Peter, and upon this rock will I build my ecclesia, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So here you got this incredible picture of literally what they called the gates of hell, because there was this big hole in the base of Mount Hermon, which they thought descended down into hell. And they had all these sacrifices, the place of the goat slaughtering, and they would slay thousands upon thousands of goats. You would go and get your goat from the city, you would bring it down, you would slaughter your goat, and you would throw it into this pool. And if the goat sank, that meant Pan had accepted your offering. If the goat floated, you were in trouble, your offering was not accepted, and you had to go and get another goat. And I guess if that happened 4 times, that would really get on your goat, because you'd be back and forward bringing one goat after another, hoping that it would sink to the bottom. And obviously that was depend on how it kills, or whether there was water in the lungs or whatever. But it was, in fact, you'll notice there's the dance floor of the sacred goats. This was the place where you get the picture on the left of Pan being a dancing goat and playing the pan flute, because they actually had trained these goats to dance, and they had lots and lots of loud music there. And before you went and slaughtered your goat, you had to go to the dance floor of the sacred goats. So it's just a fascinating place, but you can see where that was a symbol of the heart of pagan corruption. And Jesus deliberately took the disciples there to make this statement about him, about the fact that to declare who he was against these pagan religions. Incidentally, he came back to Jerusalem pretty much right after this, in the story in John chapter 7, where he goes up into the temple at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, and he says, is anyone thirsty? Let him come to me. Out of his belly will flow forth living waters. Is a picture of Jesus being the life source of the waters of life, which in fact is what Caesarea Philippi was to the Jordan River. So that's a little bit of a picture of why it's appropriate that Dan, with a massive history of idolatry, is not there in Revelation. What about Ephraim? Well, Ephraim likewise became the center of apostasy in Israel, because you'll remember Jeroboam the son of Nebat didn't just set up a golden calf in Dan, he set one up in Ephraim as well. 1 Kings chapter 12. One Kings chapter 12 and in verse 28. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem for too long. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. He set one in Bethel, and he set one in Dan. Then this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before one. So here was Jeroboam the son of Nebat establishing in Ephraim this place of pagan worship, which is mind-boggling, because that area in Ephraim, in the area of Bethel, was an area which was holy. It was the place where Jacob had first come and had his dream. It means, of course, the house of God. And people would go to Bethel to inquire at the house of God. But Jeroboam, of course, turned all of that around. Here's something else that's really interesting with Ephraim. So this is a picture of Lane Rittmeyer's archaeological work at Shiloh. This was the one I was actually hoping to go to just prior to the pandemic with Nathan Edwards. So he was working on this back in 2019. So this is the Shiloh site that you can see there on the left. Shiloh, of course, was the place where they first set up the tabernacle when they came into the land. It became the place of God's name where he would dwell. In fact, there's evidence that there was a more permanent site, and they from the tabernacle, they actually built something a little more permanent there shortly afterwards. But Jeremiah chapter 7 says this in verse 11 to 15. He said, "The house which is called by my name has become a den of robbers in your view." Now remember, Jesus quotes this when he goes up into the house of God, into the temple in Jerusalem. He says, this is my Father's house, and you have made it into a den of robbers. So he's quoting Jeremiah chapter 7, which goes on to say, this is the Lord's declaration. What I did in Shiloh, I will do to the house that's called by my name, the house in which you trust. I will drive you from my presence, just as I drove all your brothers, all the descendants of Ephraim. So here you've got a picture of the story of Ephraim, or Shiloh, or Bethel, the house of God, which was in Ephraim, being a symbol of the judgment that God is going to bring on Jerusalem. And Jesus quotes it. Not only that, it's interesting, isn't it, that Ephraim's name means fruitful. When Jesus walks into Jerusalem, he comes across a fig tree and he curses it because there's no fruit on that tree. He goes into the temple and he drives out the money changers, quoting Jeremiah 7, "You've made my Father's house a den of thieves." Then he prophesies to the people that all these things will come upon this generation, and then says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, your house will be left to you desolate." Again, citing Jeremiah chapter 7. This house is going to be made a desolation. Connecting, of course, with the story of Shiloh, Bethel, Ephraim. So hence the reason why Ephraim and Dan, I believe, are not listed in the story of Revelation chapter 7, because they both typically represented the apostasy of the nation of Israel and their decline into evil, and obviously alludes to the judgment of AD 70. So, right, I think that's me. We've done our time. So I will stop the recording and I will open it up for discussion.